For a film about tank combat, Fury's best moments are those outside the battle. What you're watching now is one of those. As our cast rolls eastward into Germany, we see surrendering soldiers, civilian refugees, one even in a wedding dress, pass them by. Everything from Stephen Price's melancholic score, the muted colours, the lingering silences, makes this a scene of complete sobriety. And then this happens.
She'll let you fuck her for a chocolate bar. That's not true.
It's completely fucking true.
We'll just give her some smokes. You ain't gotta fuck around and give her a whole pack neither. Fucking four will do it.
What makes the scene great is the underlying tragedy at the heart of the scene. For context, what Fury is depicting here is the mass migration, 4.5 million in total, of German civilians, either because of displacement or fear of what would happen if the Red Army got to them. During the last months of the war, resources were scarce, hunger set in, and prostitution became a strategy for survival. Garcia's line is as much a statement of fact, then, as it is a joke. Women trading sex with soldiers for food or protection was far from uncommon, even in areas occupied by the Western Allies. A deleted scene has Garcia extending the joke further, asking an old lady whether she'd have sex with Norman for a chocolate bar. Crass in any setting, that the old lady is resorting to stripping flesh from a dead horse just makes the joke even darker. We later find that Garcia and Travis's jokes are therefore largely based on experience. The themes implicit on the tank ride, the power relations between occupier and occupied, and the transactions German women are forced to take are brought to bear in a protracted scene mid-movie. Whilst Garcia and Travis are marauding around a recently occupied town, Sergeant Collier and Norman, with guns raised, break into an apartment. Here it's worth noting that during both the final months and the immediate post-war period, approximately 1 in 3 Berlin women alone were raped by Allied soldiers. And whilst the overwhelming majority of these were perpetrated by the Soviets, many British, French and American soldiers were far from innocent. And whilst Norman and Collier don't harm the woman, the threat or possibility of rape is absolutely, palpably, in the air. This scene provoked a small amount of controversy on release, with Melanie O'Brien criticising the film for glorifying the claiming of women as spoils of war, whilst Carl Quinn praised it as Fury's best scene. And even if we view the sex scene between Emma and Norman as Ayer presumably intends it, a consensual, tender moment of respite for both parties, this long, protracted scene functions, as Carl Quinn puts it, as a microcosm of the very idea of a military occupation. Collier may not harm them, the film never lets you forget that he is always an intruder, and through the threat of violence he turns their space into his own. During interviews, Fury's writer and director David Ayer has drawn parallels between the Allied occupation and the contemporary conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. At this stage of the war, we were the invaders instead of the liberators, which is a different dynamic from any World War II movie I've ever seen. It's a bit of an allegory, obviously, to some wars we're involved with today. Drawing parallels with something as contentious and unpopular as the Iraq War itself, Ayer adds a dash of moral ambiguity and ambivalence not commonly associated with World War II. A conflict known in the American consciousness as the Good War, the perfect example of what a just war should be. Clear sides, delineated binary morality that makes aggressive foreign policy justifiable and helps reaffirm America's self-conception as an international force for good. It's little wonder why Michael Adams sardonically calls it the best war ever. Unsurprisingly then, the American GI is at the centre of popular American depictions of the war, both as its primary protagonist and also as its victim. Fury clearly doesn't change that. But despite its focus on the soldier, far more than most, Fury is willing to widen its gaze and consider the cost of war on the civilians, and is not unwilling to implicate the Allied troops' culpability in that cost. If you want an example that does the opposite, look no further than Treyarch's Call of Duty World at War. Like Fury, its focus is on the closing days of the war, centering around the Russian advance in Berlin and the US Marines in the Pacific. The Russian campaign opens in 1942 on home soil. The player, hiding in a fountain of corpses, watches powerless as a Nazi patrol executes the injured and the dying. The next level places the player in Germany 1945. The switch up is intentional, and you're given a gun and a proposition.
Turn off! I am not hearing gunshots!
There is no point, Sergeant. They are already bleeding to death.
Maybe our friend will help them bleed faster.
For the first time in a Call of Duty game, World at War asks the player to make ethical decisions. The roles are reversed and the player is asked whether they wish to reciprocate the brutality witnessed on their soil, and whether you want to commit to the reversal from victim to perpetrator. Your Sergeant, Reznov, embodies the Red Army's lust for revenge, whilst Private Chernoff functions as its moral centre. And the player essentially chooses how he or she wishes to navigate between the two. Reznov justifies the brutality as an act of revenge.
No mercy was shown to my comrades in Stalingrad. No mercy will be shown here. An eye for an eye.
Whilst Chernoff articulates notions of restraint and compassion, and ultimately it's his moral authority whom the game privileges. The output of the two choices is his judgment rendered in the form of his diary. Depending on your actions, Chernoff brands you either a hero, unreadable, or a monster, and this is what happens if the player consistently fails to show mercy.
April 30th, 1945. When he first spoke of Dmitry, Reznov told tales of a hero, someone we should all aspire to be like. His merciless brutality defines him only as a savage, just like the rest of the Red Army. He is no hero.
Not only does he condemn you, but he reads your actions as consistent with the rest of the Red Army. If he praises you, he reads them as somewhat separate. The game characterizes brutality not as the exception, but the rule for the Russian occupation of Germany, arguing that revenge has made them equally as cruel as the Germans. Take the surrendering soldiers outside the Berlin metro, praying for mercy from soldiers atop the stairs. Their fate is deferred to the player. Should the player refrain from killing the surrendering soldiers, his comrades burn them to death anyway. And you see similar moments occur in Fury, in which captured POWs are subjected to violence and execution by American soldiers. And as you can see from the crowds that surround Norman, cheering encouragements as he is forced to shoot the captured German, is that these are not exceptions by a few bad men, but the cruelty is endemic to both fronts and all soldiers. Through these choices, however, World at War seems to articulate that atrocity is a choice, and that war can be waged without it. By separating these choice moments from the rest of the game's moving and shooting, the game implies that anything the player does outside them is free from judgment, i.e. ethically unassailable. So that when the American campaign has no such choice moments, World at War frames America's conduct in the war as without question. Indeed, there's something oddly humanistic about that compared to Fury, which depicts its brutality as an almost necessity. The very plot hinges around the crew turning the inexperienced Norman into a killing machine. His inability to shoot children costs a tank crew their lives, and the execution scene is one example of the efforts made to brutalize him into his role as gunner.
Fucking Nazi. Fuck you!
The title they give him when he finally meshes with the rest of the crew is literally Machine. For World at War, however, outside of those two choices, levels are literally devoid of any non-combatants, be they be surrendering soldiers or civilians. This is particularly egregious to the Berlin sections. As aforementioned, the sheer scale of rapes committed by the Red Army is well documented. And in Okinawa, civilian casualties were between 75,000 and 80,000. Granted, the levels in Okinawa are set in specifically military installations, but that just reinforces the idea that it was exclusively soldiers who bore the war's cost. By sidestepping any civilian perspective, the game further omits any possibility for the Americans to do questionable acts. In so doing, World at War is one of the many titles that proliferates an uncritical depiction of the US soldier, for grounding his experience at the expense of the non-combatants. Even more so than the Russian campaign, the Pacific theater is, as Duncan Fyfe puts it, a military wet dream, in which the player's violence is never not justified by the circumstances. And in so doing, Treyarch's depiction of the American GI fails to deviate or challenge the uncomplicated binary morality of the good war that Fury does such a good job of muddying. And for a game in which limbs fly and people writhe as their skin crackles, the result is somewhat oddly bloodless.
A big thank you to this week's guest contributor John Gledhill, who wrote, recorded and edited this video essay. If you'd like to see more from Full Fat videos, please check out our channel, and why not check out our Facebook and Instagram pages for all the latest updates. Until next week, stay milky.